Sawasdee krab. Good morning from Bangkok. Welcome to our book launch and discussion today. My name is Thitinan Pongsuchirak. I'm a professor and director of the Institute of Security International Studies based here at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. So today we have an informal discussion based on a book by Ben Bland, and I'll just hold up this book. It's called, this is the book, Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. And I'll just say a little bit about Ben Bland. Is the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute. Ben was previously an award-winning foreign correspondent for the Financial Times in Indonesia, China and Vietnam. His first book, Generation HK, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. That was his first book, and here is his book again. And it's now available in Thailand's bookshops at Kinokuniya, for example. And we were planning to do this book launch some weeks ago, but we had to wait until the book is available in the bookshelves in the bookstores. So now it is, and we're happy to do this book launch. Let me launch right into it. I want to first welcome Ben Bland. He's sitting there in Sydney, a few hours ahead of us. And Ben, this is a good read. I mean, what I like is that the format is very readable. The style, of course, very readable. There are a lot of issues that come off it. And as I told you before, and our audience will know that we don't do a lot of book launches, but I think this one is timely. I think we don't know enough, we don't learn enough about leaders and countries in maritime Southeast Asia. Sitting here in Bangkok, we know a lot about Myanmar, of course, these days, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, but we don't know as much about Philippines, Indonesia, and so on, especially Indonesia. So this is the largest Muslim country in the world, the third largest democracy in the world, and it's being led by this man named Joko Widodo, and he's affectionately called, commonly called Jokowi. And we only see him in the news, read about him here, remotely, peripherally, not central. But today we're going to focus on Joko Widodo, Jokowi, and how he's kind of remade or trying to remake Indonesia. So, Kun Chaiwat, can you put up some questions? I have just a way of formatting. Kun Chenครับขอคำถามด้วยครับ. I have just a way of formatting or kind of setting us up for a discussion by posing just some general questions. We also invite questions and comments from the audience in writing, preferably to save time. But from this book, maybe we can talk about 7 issues, questions, and then you can also, Ben, raise your own, point out your own. But what I found intriguing about the book is how Jokowi is this is a very complex man, very humble origins, and he has kind of, become a politician. And there are 2 ways about him. The relationships he has with the elites of Indonesia. It's really intriguing how he's been able to get them to support him. This would be the old elites, the financial elites. In some countries, we might even call them the oligarchies, the oligarchs. He was able to persuade them for their support, and then he also can communicate and relate to the masses. So the relationship both with elites and masses, a bit of contradiction, but he studied in Indonesia. Inclusiveness, the relationship between civilian leaders, military leaders. We've found that in Myanmar, in Thailand, and other countries, it needs civil military relations need to be managed effectively for democracy to consolidate, for democratization. And Jokowi has absorbed, for example, his rival, his competitor, General Prabowo, into his cabinet. So the civil military relations in Indonesia are very workable. We don't see any kind of a military coup coming up out of Indonesia. Governance performance, I'll let you talk a little bit about that, how he runs a palace in an imperial style. It's interesting. The economic management, he has some reforms, he has some protectionist tendencies, a bit of a mix there, contradiction as well, and then COVID more recently, and then maybe the geostrategic positioning of Indonesia as a global maritime fulcrum, and if we have time, a bit of legacy post-Jokowi Indonesia. So Ben Bland, let me turn over the floor to you. The audience are listening. Maybe you can give us a 5-minute synopsis of the book, and then maybe we can go to the questions.
Okay, Sawadee Krap, everyone. Thanks so much, Titinan, for the introduction, and thanks so much to ISIS Thailand for hosting me for this discussion today. I think it's interesting that you say that you don't hear much about Indonesia in Thailand. Obviously, that's a problem all over the world. John Riyadi, who's a kind of new generation leader of one of the big conglomerates in Indonesia, others may call it an oligarchy. I guess they wouldn't, but he likes to talk about Indonesia as the world's biggest invisible object, which I think is a great expression that gets to that sense of this huge country, the 4th most populous country in the world, 3rd biggest democracy, biggest Muslim majority nation, biggest ASEAN economy, etc., but really little understood and little known about even in many neighboring countries, let alone the wider world. That's obviously a big problem here in Australia too. And I remember talking to Kurt Campbell, the new Indo-Pacific czar in the Joe Biden administration, before he was appointed, about Indonesia. And he was bemoaning the ignorance about Indonesia in the US, but I reassured him that America has no monopoly on ignorance in Indonesia, shared in Europe, Australia, and sadly around the region. So in my very, very small way, my book was an attempt to try and get more interest in Indonesia, to explain more about Jokowi. I think this remarkable leader who came really from nowhere to lead the world's 3rd biggest democracy, and I think has been quite an impactful leader in his time in office. So this is my little attempt to help there. I think it's ambitious in a book that's just some 180, I think, pages, to try and tell the story of a leader and tell the story of his country and the country's struggles to develop in the 70 plus years since independence in 1945. But I thought it was important because, to me, I think Jokowi's story is deeply interwoven with kind of the wider struggle of Indonesia to remake itself, as I say in the book title. And I think that fits a broader theme across much of post-colonial Southeast Asia. I guess Thailand's obviously a bit of an exception given your history. But for the rest of Southeast Asia, most of the countries were only independent during or after the Second World War, really quite young countries struggling with a lot of foundational questions about the basis of state power, who can control that state power, the nature of the economy. And I see in Jokowi's struggles during his time as president since 2014, many of these deeper struggles reflected, which I talk about as contradictions, if you like. So very broadly, I think for Indonesia, the contradictions are that between democracy and authoritarianism, not just authoritarian political system, but authoritarian thinking as well, which I think remains quite deeply embedded in the bureaucracy and the governing class. Then I talk about this broader contradiction between Indonesia's need for foreign capital and technology and its really quite deeply held protectionist instincts, which again go back to Indonesia's bitter experience of Dutch colonial exploitation at the hands of economic liberalism, as the Dutch would have put it. And then lastly, it's this question, I guess, of religion and society. So the fact that Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim majority nation, but it remains not a secular state, as people often call it, but a non-denominational religious state. So a very unusual position. Most other Muslim majority nations tend to have Islam in their constitution. They tend to have some sort of Islamic explicit framing in the way their state is set up. That's not the case for Indonesia. And there's been a long fight between different forces in the Indonesian state and society since 1945, with some pushing for a much more explicit role for Islam and others trying to keep this more pluralist conception. And I think these deeper contradictions, we've seen Jokowi grappling with them over the last now 7 years since he's been president, as he's tried to kind of push ahead with this vision for an Indonesia that is going to be richer, more socially just, more respected, and more impactful on the world stage.
Okay, thank you for that opening, Ben. So in terms of his style, you mentioned in the book that the contradictions, his outreach to the masses, and he feels very comfortable being amongst people because he himself sees himself as a kind of a humble man from a small town, a furniture maker, a small business. But he also was able to relate and to win over the old elites, the powerful elites. So that contradiction, Ben, can you tell us a little bit more about that throughout the book? I mean, these contradictions keep coming up.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most fascinating contradictions for me. I mean, I first met Jokowi back in 2012 when I was a correspondent for the Financial Times in Jakarta, and I landed straight into this election race. At the time, he was running to be the governor of Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, a huge city of 10+ million people. And Jokowi really electrified this campaign without saying much, because he had this knack for connecting to people. And he also had a knack in political terms for, I don't know, what would you say? I'd say it's a retail political talent, an ability to use the sense that people liked him and to think about how to project himself, in a way that would deepen that perception, while at the same time keeping very strong connections with the political elite in political parties in Indonesia, who are essential for giving him channels of funding, but also for nominating him for his various positions as he's fought for election. So it was incredible to see. He would turn up at a rally, there'd be tens of thousands of people there, real enthusiasm. And I remember his opponent, who was the incumbent governor at the time. It was very much a typical Indonesian political rally where people were bussed in, they were given free T-shirts and flags, and it was all very lackluster. It was traditional machine politics, whereas at Jokowi's rallies, people came on their own, on their bicycles, on their motorbikes. They actually paid with their own money, their own hard-earned money, to buy Jokowi T-shirts. So he had this incredible ability from the start, which I think is something very rare in any political system, right? So many people in every country dream of being president, prime minister, of being a minister, a mayor, a governor. And, money is important in every system. Let's not kid ourselves. But you can only buy your way so far. And beyond that, you need this talent for connecting, which I think Jokowi has. Partly it's, as Jokowi puts it, it's his wajah kampung in Indonesian. So he has the face of someone from the village. He looks like and sounds like an ordinary Indonesian, which partly relates to his upbringing, and it's partly the way he manages his politics. So during his campaigns to be governor and then president initially, he would wear this red and white checked shirt, which was a very explicit decision because it made him look like a humble worker, effectively. So it's partly talent, it's partly his background, it's partly his management, both of kind of voters and voter expectation, and his management of the elite. So he started as an outsider, and that was how he projected himself to the public. But he's always used his elite backing to get to the top of the tree. And just lastly, I think this tells us something very interesting about him as a leader. So he's a very hard person to categorize. As academics, think tankers, journalists, we love to throw labels at people, right? A reformer, a pragmatist, a nationalist. Quite a lot of academics try to frame Jokowi as a populist, which I personally found a bit strange, because while it's true Jokowi has this connection to the people, he doesn't have many of the other kind of traditional traits of a populist. So for starters, Jokowi doesn't use the kind of divisive, intemperate language that we see Duterte, Bolsonaro, Trump using. Unlike them as well, Jokowi doesn't claim to be the sole representative of the people's sovereign will. So Jokowi is much more of a pluralist leader in that sense. And I said, while he's liked by the people and he's extremely popular, he also doesn't expressly pitch himself against the elites. He always works with the elites. So I find that to be a strange framing that kind of misses this contradictory element. And of course, at times that means he will disappoint the people, and at other times he'll disappoint the elite. And that's kind of the balance that he's tried to find throughout his time in office. But electorally, it's been remarkably successful.
Yes, thank you. It seems to me that he works with the establishment rather than goes against it. So that's, I think, one characteristic of someone who will be populist, that will be kind of running on an anti-establishment kind of credential. But maybe we can talk a little bit about, in comparative terms, Ben, what I find, instructive about this book, and in terms of political systems. If you look at comparative political systems, a leader like this normally would be an insider. Political systems that allow complete outsiders to rise to the top are very rare. I mean, but it also tells something about that system. So that system, it means it's open enough. It can allow mobility, upward mobility in politics and in the party system and so on. So in his case, he from the book, he was backed by Megawati, PDIP, and then he was able to rise that way. But he also was able to kind of carve out his own space as a complete outsider around Southeast Asia. We don't see that in Aung San Suu Kyi. Even Thaksin Shinawatra was not really a complete outsider. He was in politics way before he became prime minister. Hun Sen is not. The Vietnamese and the Laotian systems are kind of closed systems. And then Duterte is a bit of an outsider, but Duterte now has temptations to have a kind of a dynastic legacy, But Jokowi, complete outsider, it looks like he will serve 2 terms and he'll be out. Is that the case?
Well, it is fascinating how quickly he rose. I mean, we have seen other world leaders come from relatively humble backgrounds, but rarely so quickly. So for Jokowi, it was just 9 years from him being effectively the manager of a small furniture factory in his home city of Surakarta or Solo, a small city of 500,000 people. So he was running a small, marginally successful furniture exporting business. 9 years later, he was the president of Indonesia. So it was a remarkably rapid rise. So it's not just the fact that he was an outsider, but that he did it so quickly. And that is testament to the high quality of Indonesian elections. The fact is these are free and fair elections. There is a lot of money sloshing around, and incumbent political parties and political party bosses do have a lot of power within that system. But at the end of the day, those parties need candidates who can actually win votes. And because the elections are free and fair, that's what allowed Jokowi to get to the top. In fact, against the will of Megawati Sukarno Putri, the former president and his party boss, she really wanted her daughter, Puan Maharani, to be the presidential candidate. But they just saw that they couldn't rival Jokowi's power at the ballot box to win votes, his power on TV to captivate the attention of Indonesians. So Jokowi defied a lot of tycoons, a lot of powerful political families, including Prabowo Subianto, now his defense minister. Prabowo and his family were initially backers of Jokowi's campaign to be Jakarta governor in 2012 because they thought, we can use this rising star to improve our reputation by being connected with him. And then that will support Prabowo's campaign for the presidency in 2014. In the end, they effectively created the monster who destroyed them, who defeated Prabowo twice at the presidential ballot box in 2014 and 2019. So it's really interesting to see. But then when you get onto this question of legacy and dynasty, that's where we start to see, I guess, this image of Jokowi the outsider really come under pressure, because at the last set of regional elections last year, quite against people's expectations, Jokowi did smooth the path for his son and son-in-law to enter politics. So his son took over effectively his seat as mayor of Solo in an election against a very weak candidate. His son-in-law won the mayoralty of Medan, an important city in North Sumatra. Obviously, these were free and fair elections, but Jokowi had always said he wouldn't use his power to support his family. And the fear is that now he is taking that traditional path of many other political leaders in many systems, frankly, not just in Southeast Asia, where inevitably the family gets in on the act. So that's a concern. And there has also been some speculation that there might be an attempt to change the constitution to allow Jokowi to serve a 3rd term. Jokowi has denied that he's interested in doing so. And mostly it's been his critics who've been pushing this argument. So for now, it looks like that he will step down after his 2 terms. His son and son-in-law will be in politics, but we don't know what role they'll have. And I'd say the key for me in Indonesia is that despite the money of the parties and the money politics and the corruption in politics, you still have to win an election. And so you still need some degree of likability, and Indonesian voters want to see candidates who have some sort of track record to show that they care about the people and improving their lives. So I'm hopeful in the end that the power of free and fair elections will act as a kind of check and balance against elite control of the political system, which is still very strong. And this is really a contest, right? That's what part of the reasons I talk about democracy versus authoritarianism, that many of the elite figures in politics, in the military, in the business community, they don't really like contestation and transparency and accountability. So they want to use the machinery of democracy to shut down choice. But so long as the elections are free and fair, I think people have an ability to push back, which is really important in the Indonesian context.
Okay, thank you. So for elections to be free and fair, the election monitoring and supervising agencies have to be independent, autonomous. I want to return to this in a bit, but right now let me focus on the Prabowo Subianto, the general, the Special Forces commander, former Special Forces commander. And you know, Indonesia is one of those transition countries from military eras in the past, entrenched militaries in the past, in Sukarno, Suharto, and then when Suharto fell from grace, lost way. In the late 1990s, I found it very, you know, fascinating, but also impressive that the way that they transitioned in Indonesia from chaos, really, you know, 1997, 1998 economic crisis, late 1990s, there was a lot of violence, and then but that period to the early 2000s. They had a democratic transition that was successful. And in partly dealing with that transition, they had to deal with the military institution, right? And now we're seeing civil military relations, relationships between civilian leaders, military generals become unworkable. I mean, the role of military generals in politics in Thailand, now in Myanmar. Indonesia has been one of these cases along with the Philippines. But they've got over that. And you mentioned that he beat Prabowo twice. But how come Prabowo allowed it? How come the military in Indonesia stayed back in the barracks?
It's a really pertinent time to be having this discussion, Tiznan, as you say, given what we see happening in the rest of the region. And I know if you talk to a lot of civil society activists and academics who look at democracy in Indonesia, they will argue that Indonesia is now backsliding, that there's a democratic recession, and they are concerned about some degree of the military and the police exercising or trying to exercise more control in the political sphere. And I think those concerns are certainly real. But I think, well, as with so many questions, it's about time frame, right? So if you compare things with 10 years ago, maybe it's not as good as it once was, or as good as where people hoped things would go. But if you look back, as you said earlier, to 1997, 1998, the fall of the Suharto regime, and fears then that there might have been a full coup d'etat, a shift to a full direct military regime, even without the kind of theoretical trappings of organized, guided democracy that were there under Suharto and Sukarno, that didn't happen. And, you know, the Indonesian military after 1998 were given some reserved seats in the parliament. And then after a period of time, those seats were taken away. So I think by and large, in the kind of longer durée, it's actually been a remarkably successful transition for Indonesia. And that's partly to do with, you know, the military. And that's partly to do with the expectations of the Indonesian public. I mean, losers' consent, I think, is a really important part of a democracy. We saw that losers' consent suspended, really, by Donald Trump in the US after the election. And in Indonesia, with Prabowo and other leaders who've lost elections, we saw something similar, but in a more kind of performative way, usually. So they'll tend to protest the election was stolen. They'll bring a case to the Constitutional Court. But in the end, as and when they lose that, they'll ultimately, in practice, accept the results. After the last presidential election, there were some violent riots on the streets of Jakarta that seemed to have some degree of meddling from various political actors, but it was relatively short-lived, thankfully. So it has been, by and large, a peaceful transition. And one of the reasons for that, I think, as you're alluding to, is that Jokowi has worked hard to include key military figures in his government. So it's not just Prabowo, who eventually he appointed as his defense minister, Luhut Panjaitan, who plays this big coordinating ministry role. Some people call him the minister for everything. Jokowi's chief of staff, Muldoko, is a former chief of the Indonesian military. And there are many other key figures in and around the government who are former generals. I think Jokowi has done that deliberately because when he first came to power as this outsider, he feared that he didn't have enough ties to the military. He feared that they might form an alternative power base. But I think the concern wasn't that they would launch a coup. It was more that they would form their own alternative political parties or political coalitions to oppose him or make his life difficult and defeat him through the ballot box. But thankfully in Indonesia, there is a broad acceptance, even in the military, that the ballot box and kind of the public debate, that's the way to have these contests, not through kind of the military coming back out of the barracks and having a direct role in politics. So I think that's a good sign for Indonesia and a good sign for the region, at least, that this is possible. But obviously, it's a unique historical context in Indonesia. And as I said, the compromise hasn't been easily won. And there are concerns about backsliding. So in the last election in 2019, the last presidential election, there were complaints that Jokowi's campaign was using the police and sometimes the military to pressure local leaders, to shut down government critics, that those concerns were there. And some people have raised a concern about kind of a partially militarized response to COVID-19, that the military and the police have really been put at the heart of the response to COVID-19, when perhaps it should have been epidemiologists and others. So there are still some concerns there, but relative to what's happened in Myanmar or Thailand, Indonesia is for sure a really big success story of transition away from a long period of military-dominated rule.
Yes, thank you. You know, in societies that have military authoritarian backgrounds, so, you know, say South Korea, for example, Republic of Korea. South Korea is a textbook example of the kind of democratic transition leading to democratic consolidation. And at some point, it reaches a point of no return, meaning that there will most likely not be a military coup to change government and power holders again in South Korea. And Indonesia, seems to me, is approaching that point of no return, if not having passed it already. But this is to compare, Ben, with the Myanmar. You know, there's a lot of, Myanmar has been in the news a lot, of course, and since February 1st, a military coup. And a lot of people think that the relationship between Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing was not effectively managed. So there was not enough of the power sharing. You know, over time, the power sharing between civilian leaders, military generals, during democratic transitions, it has to be workable in a way that the military remains on side. So what Jokowi has done with Prabowo, Luhut, you know, he's brought them in, very inclusive kind of power sharing. He didn't antagonize them. Now, in Myanmar, people say that, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi should have and could have made Min Aung Hlaing, you know, close to his retirement, some kind of a maybe president, some special vice president, some special person of some kind, and share the stage with him a bit more and being more inclusive. So this is a matter of, you know, Monday quarterbacking and a bit of a speculation about what should have happened. But this relationship, I think, between civilian leaders and military generals is consequential for how the country, you know, performs moving forward. And Indonesia has gone over this well. And Jokowi is a good example, I think, of still managing it well. You know, so the military generals don't have a problem with them.
If I could just jump in, just to add two quick things. I mean, the first to say, I think we also have to, you know, give a lot of credit to the previous president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, you know, who was himself, of course, a former general in the Suharto era. And he was Indonesia's first directly elected president. And he was someone who thought very carefully about these questions of transition, you know, from military to civilian rule. And I think it helped that he was a former general, but someone who was softly spoken, who did care about democratization. And so he was the right kind of person to both reassure the military that he would kind of protect their interests to a certain extent, but also reassuring the people that Indonesia was on this democratic transition. With Jokowi, it's much more instinctive. So I don't think he lies awake at night thinking about, you know, civil military fusion and transitions. It's instinctive. He thinks, I want to neutralize opposition. I want to stop, you know, those guys being a threat to me. I want balance in my government. So I think it's an instinctive thing. And just the last thing I'd say, that there is a cost to that, right? And obviously that presumably in Myanmar was what Aung San Suu Kyi was concerned about. The cost of building this kind of big tent coalition can be a lack of government effectiveness. It can be a lack of focus on human rights, frankly speaking. And it can be kind of slowing the pace of not just economic reform, but political reform, reforms to the legal system. Even in Indonesia, there's quite a few things that still need to be done. And I think that's the kind of compromise Jokowi has made, favoring in the end stability over change. And that's another one of his many contradictions, that he pitches himself in many ways as a reformer, but he's actually, small c, quite conservative in the way he works with established centers of power and established figures. So, you know, that's politics, right? There is no ideal solutions. This is not a theoretical academic game. It's just a dirty, messy business of compromises. And, you know, when you look at the bigger picture, I agree. I think Indonesia's done a good job. I would hope, like you said, that Indonesia now, there is no turning back. You never know. Politics is so unpredictable. But I think Indonesian people certainly highly value their ability to choose their leaders and wouldn't readily give that up.
You mentioned SBY, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the former president, military man himself. So I think this is another issue that, in comparative terms, the role of leadership, the transformational leadership. I mean, not just Yudhoyono, but going back, you know, to the post-Suharto, Wahid, Gus Dur, Habibie, Megawati in her time. So these leaders enable the system to kind of transition and consolidate. So I think this is something that also is instructive for other societies elsewhere trying to transition to a more democratic future. Otherwise, the system can buy back and the empire strikes back. Let me turn a little bit now. Ben, you mentioned some of his style, and maybe we could talk a little bit about governance and the policy achievements or outcomes or shortcomings. The one protrusive case, I mean, I always have this thought about Jakarta being moved to some other place far away in the middle of nowhere. And I thought that was really a bold move. I thought it was going to happen when it was first proposed. I thought Jokowi had such a heft and he had a lot of political support, majority, but in the end, it didn't really pan out. So can you talk a little bit about his policy performance? I think it's mixed, but maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, so this is another way I think that a lot of analysts got Jokowi wrong, that he was portrayed as a technocrat by a lot of people, as a reformer. But when I went and traced his track record as mayor of his home city of Solo and governor of Jakarta, you saw someone who was really a man of action. You know, he wasn't a thinker. He didn't plan. He's not a strategic leader. He's very tactical, fighting the day-to-day battles. As he would put it, he goes to the ground, he sees what the problem is, he talks to people, and he finds a solution. And obviously that works quite well when you're governing your own home city of 500,000 people. It's maybe just about feasible for a city of 10 million, although it was hard in Jakarta because it's so complex. It doesn't really work for a country of 270 million people spread over thousands of different islands. And I think the challenge for Jokowi is he's never really been able to find a way to take that kind of approach that he had and scale it up, because he's someone who doesn't like to delegate power clearly. As quite a number of his advisors put it to me, he runs, they call it a presidential palace in Indonesia, and he runs it like a palace, like an imperial court. So there aren't really clear lines of authority. You see that ministers go in and out of his favor. Sometimes they're his favorites, then he gets rid of them. Sometimes they stay in the job, but they get pushed to the side. You don't really know who's in charge. He has various spokespeople, but no one ever seems to know what exactly Jokowi's thinking, which is quite a contrast with SBY, who had this sort of kitchen cabinet of people around him. They would know at any one point what SBY was thinking. They could get a message to him or from him. Jokowi works in a very different, more unpredictable, some people would say it's kind of a traditional Javanese style of government, but I think it's just a kind of imperial style. It's not unique to Java necessarily. So I think that means that it's been hard for him, while he's had big ambitions for economic reform in particular and moving the capital, he hasn't necessarily achieved as much as he would have liked, but he hadn't put the right processes in place. So he governs through personalities, not processes. So I think his reforms have been quite limited. Early on, economically, he reduced fuel subsidies. Then he had a kind of series of tinkering packages designed to make life easier for foreign investors. And then, to be fair, last year he had this big bang omnibus law, which did, to be fair, change quite a few things in terms of, on paper, improving access to foreign investors and making it easy for Indonesian companies to hire and fire and to invest too. But none of that's yet been implemented. So I think there's a lot of promise there, a lot of ambition, but he hasn't really governed in the way that would allow these deeper reforms to happen. And I think, just lastly, this plan to move the capital speaks to that. It was something that was very instinctive. So every Indonesian president, going back to the first one, Sukarno, has dreamed of building this kind of new capital city as their kind of legacy. And Jokowi jumped on it, I think in a very unstructured way. But then he did seem very committed to the idea. Unfortunately, COVID-19 came along and they're still talking about doing it, but it's going to be hard now, given Indonesia in its first recession since the Asian financial crisis, to get the plan up and running. But Jokowi didn't really think about why he was doing it. There wasn't a clear feasibility study. It was very instinctive and impulsive. He likes physical infrastructure, given his experience as a furniture maker, as a city mayor. So I think he saw that as his legacy. But they didn't think, is this the best way to spend $35 billion, which was the projected cost of the project? They didn't think what the opportunity costs would be of pursuing this rather than other projects. And I think we've seen a similar approach play out in COVID-19, where there's been a very kind of messy, unstructured approach, kind of day by day, week by week. All governments have struggled, frankly, with the pandemic. But I think we've seen the same lack of kind of clear analytical thinking in his government when it's come to COVID-19 too, which is a concern. I mean, it's good to have ambitions and it's fine to have your own kind of way of governing. And Jokowi's political instincts are strong in many ways. But to get real change, to reform, you need processes as well as instincts.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I'm mindful of our audience members. So let me just raise 3 more issues, and then we're going to open up the floor to any questions or comments from the audience. The economy, COVID, and foreign policy. So in terms of economic performance, Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia. It has a lot of promise, big market, 270 million people you mentioned, also pretty young demographics, rising income, more middle class and so on. And when investors look at Southeast Asia, they look at, it used to be Thailand, but now I think it's Vietnam. And Indonesia always comes up because it's a large market. But do you think that it has maybe underachieved a little bit? There were some reforms, but there were also some protectionist measures under Jokowi, his instincts, maybe not so liberal on the economy. What do you think?
Yeah, Indonesia is kind of the land of promise. I remember former Finance Minister Hatib Basri saying something like, Indonesia has a lot of potential and it always will because it's never going to achieve it. So I think it's one of those stories probably of underachievement. Jokowi himself, when he came to power in 2014, set a goal of getting GDP growth up to 7% a year from sort of the 5 to 6% level it had been tracking at. And basically, it's just before COVID-19, GDP was stuck at 5%. But I think more importantly than that, there was a sense that Indonesia wasn't creating enough quality jobs for its rapidly expanding workforce, 2 to 3 million young people joining the labor force every year. Quite a high degree of economic inequality, a high degree of economic insecurity. So while the poverty rate had been coming down bit by bit, a lot of people are cycling in and out of poverty every year, even before COVID hit. And that's dealt another massive blow. It's driven millions of people, out of work. Many more of Indonesians, mostly working in the informal sector, their income has been depressed, their opportunities to earn, as well as the health costs and the extra strain on the already kind of overburdened health system. So I think that's dealt a massive blow. But the bigger question for me is this kind of economic philosophy question, if you like. So Jokowi wanted more GDP growth. He said foreign investment is the way to get it. That's what he told foreigners. But when he's talking to domestic audiences, he talks about self-sufficiency. He repeats this kind of Sukarnoist rhetoric of Indonesia standing on its own 2 feet. And I think it's led to very confused mixed messaging, both to investors, but also to the Indonesian bureaucracy. So on the one hand, they're told sort of help foreign investors. On the other hand, they're told no, Indonesians first. And we had a great example of this in the last few weeks when Jokowi's been promoting these omnibus law reforms as this big bang that Indonesia is now open for business, forget all the old problems of the past. Now we want to help you invest. At the same time, he gave a big speech in Indonesia calling on Indonesians to love Indonesian products, but hate foreign products. Those were his words, very strong in the Indonesian language as well, to talk about hating foreign products. And people would ask, which is the real Jokowi? And I think, well, both are the real Jokowi, because he's not really thinking about how to form his own economic philosophy. He wants higher growth. He wants more foreign investment, but he's also an economic nationalist by instinct. And I think this does go back to these founding questions for Indonesia, that it's Indonesia had a really terrible experience of colonial economic liberalism. Indonesia in its constitution talks about a family orientation of the economy, state control over resources. But the economic reality for Indonesia as a developing economy is it needs foreign investment. It needs foreign know-how and capital to grow its economy. And I think this tension remains unresolved. And there is a smarter way to do it. If you look to what Korea did, Taiwan, Singapore, in their own ways, they were very protectionist, but they managed to carve out which parts of our economy will open up, which parts will keep. And they did it in a very strategic, structured way. I think under Jokowi, and to be fair, previous Indonesian presidents, it's been very messy, and they haven't found a way to sell these reforms to their public. And I think that has to be the target going forward. Coming to some sort of balance where this part of Indonesia's economy will be open. We will protect Indonesian workers in these other ways with social assistance, healthcare, etc. And these parts of the economy will preserve for state-owned enterprises or national control. And without that kind of clear strategic compromise, I think it's going to be very hard for Indonesia to achieve the heights that Jokowi is looking for. But more than that, I think they risk storing up a lot of problems due to slower growth, widening social inequality, and strains on the health system, etc.
I also wonder if that tension and contradiction is partly rooted in the old kind of non-aligned movement, how Indonesia wants to kind of maintain its autonomy and self-sufficiency. We'll come back to that as a last question. What's the outlook on COVID handling and from the virus stage to the vaccine stage? Do you think that Indonesia will be able to reopen by the end of this year?
I think Indonesia is in a difficult but not disastrous place, I guess. COVID-19 has tested all our political systems and our political leaders, and I don't think Jokowi has done a great job. I don't think the Indonesian government has done a terrible job, but I still feel for all of us, we're in the early stages, frankly, still of this pandemic. We don't know how things are going to go. Look at India. India seemed to be on top of it. It was rolling out vaccines at one of the fastest paces in the world. It was making vaccines. It was meant to be producing vaccines for Indonesia, for many other developing countries too, in Southeast Asia and Africa, who were reliant on it. And then things can change so quickly. So I don't think anyone can rest on their laurels. I think Jokowi's government did a good job managing some of the financial concerns at the beginning. There were worries that there could be some sort of problem in the banking sector, and they were quite ambitious in allowing the central bank to start buying government debts. And that actually stabilized concerns about the financial system, which was really important. I think when it comes to managing the pandemic in itself, Indonesia's data is really bad. So Indonesia has one of the lowest testing rates of any major country in the world. So we don't really know fully how bad things are. If you look at the figures thus far, Indonesia is kind of outperforming where you might expect, given its population and its economic development. But probably the real extent of the deaths and disease is a few times worse than the figures, given the limited testing. But I do think in Indonesia, the government has tried. It's just been confusing messaging. So sometimes Jokowi says, we've just got to live with the virus. Other times he said, no, the virus is very dangerous. We have to change what we do. Indonesia ultimately, like a lot of countries, was pinning its hopes on the vaccine rollout. And they started quite quickly. But now, because of every other country looking to vaccinate, because of the problems in India and elsewhere, supply is really squeezed. So I think that's going to make it very hard for Indonesia to hit Jokowi's target to vaccinate 2/3 of the population by the end of this year. So I think it's going to be a difficult time for Indonesia, as for many other developing countries. And there's so much talk around the world about, oh, we don't want vaccine nationalism. But that's what every country with vaccines is doing. They're hoarding them. So I think until there's some sort of more equitable distribution, Indonesia is probably going to be on the wrong end of kind of vaccine distribution, and that's going to make it hard for Indonesia to open up. And at the end of the day, we know that you can't get your economy moving again until you're through the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. As the last question now on foreign policy, foreign relations, and Indonesia's role in the world. You mentioned a little bit earlier about this tension in economic management about being open, but also being insular, trying to boost growth, but also want to have self-sufficiency. And I also see contradictions in Indonesia's international projections. I think, of course, Indonesia is the biggest country in ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but at the same time, it's also a member of the G20. Sometimes I see Indonesia as not being satisfied with its role in ASEAN because maybe the ASEAN platform is not big enough for where Indonesia should be. It has a big role in the Islamic world, G20 and beyond. And there was a time when they were talking up early in Jokowi's administration about Indonesia being a global maritime fulcrum. So this was the geostrategic ambition at the time. And since then, it hasn't really kind of fulfilled its approach, its ambitions, partly because I think it was not, as you mentioned in the book, was not really spelled out, what it was, that vision. But now we see Indonesia Jakarta just hosted at the ASEAN Secretariat a special summit on Myanmar's crisis. And Indonesia now is kind of the main sponsor of finding peace and resolutions and dialogue in Myanmar. So it's still playing that big role. But going forward, Jokowi, is he more domestic? Is that the problem? Is that the limitation, Ben? I mean, one of his advisors told me early on, some years ago, that it was very difficult to get him to be interested in international affairs, in Indonesia's role in the world. He's very kind of domestic. Is that the case?
I think that's definitely part of it. So Jokowi has always wondered, what's the point of going to these ASEAN and UN forums? As one of his diplomats said to me, there's no money at the UN General Assembly. And in his first 5 or 6 years, Jokowi didn't attend a single UNGA meeting. So he's very pragmatic. He's very focused on the economy. And I think he tried to make Indonesian foreign policy and diplomacy a kind of tool of his economic objectives. So he tried to get Indonesian diplomats to focus on mostly promoting trade and investment and staying out of trouble, looking after Indonesians overseas, making sure there are no disputes that would undermine his overriding economic goals. So I think it's partly a personal character question, but I think there's something deeper there in Indonesian history. I mean, Indonesia's foreign policy orientation is really non-aligned. They talk about being independent and active as being kind of the grounding of their place in the world. And I think the problem with any country that's really focused on this non-alignment is that being independent and active, if you're too focused on it, you tend to be passive and constrained, right? Because if you're so focused on not aligning with anyone, it's very hard to do anything. So I think that's one element of it. The other part of it is that while Indonesia is it literally invented the UN definition of the archipelagic state when it comes to the law of the sea. And it is this huge maritime country that connects and sits on all these key trading routes, etc. But it's actually a very inward-looking country in a sense. Like it thinks more like a land-based, a territorial nation. So for the government, for a lot of strategic thinkers, they worry about Indonesia breaking up. They worry more about internal security, insurgency in Papua, breakaway, other parts of Indonesia. That's more a security concern than outward security issues. And that's partly because of Indonesia's geography, that it sits outside the South China Sea disputes for the most part. It's far away from a lot of the other kind of issues in the region. So I think it's partly due to that lucky situation. It's partly Indonesia's recent history. But given all that, it is somewhat surprising and very welcome that Jokowi and his foreign minister, Retno Marsudi, have stepped up on the Myanmar question, because it's clear to me that without Indonesia's leadership, there would have been almost no ASEAN action. Brunei, the current chair, was not even planning on holding an ASEAN summit in the first half of this year, because while it's a very rich state, it doesn't have much diplomatic capacity even to organize an ASEAN summit in normal times, let alone during COVID and with this huge crisis going on in Myanmar. So while you can quibble about the outcome of the ASEAN summit, I think it did show leadership from Jokowi for Indonesia to step up and hold the summit. It could have all gone wrong. It could yet go wrong and really rub off badly on him. And I don't think, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, who also have been quite strongly in raising their concerns about what's going on in Myanmar, they would not have stepped up without Indonesia taking the lead, taking the flak. So I think it has been good to see. It's been a bit of a turn up for the books. And it should reminds me and should remind everyone that politics and life is unpredictable. You might think you understand a leader or a country, but they can always do things that you don't expect. So I think it's been good to see, but I don't think at the end of the day it fundamentally changes the calculus for Jokowi or for Indonesia, that in the end, most of Indonesia's challenges are domestic, and that will probably be where the lion's share of the resources and attention goes. And so I think, a lot of outside powers want to see Indonesia play a more constructive role in the world. I think for the most part, that won't happen, just because Indonesia has so many other priorities and it's so wary of being seen to be too close to any one bloc or major power.
Okay, thank you. Let me expand in two directions on that note, on your comments about foreign policy projections. One is about China, and then the other, Myanmar. So China, you mentioned that Indonesia is really not in the South China Sea frame, and South China Sea is a hotspot of tension now because of the artificial islands, and the Philippines and Vietnam, of course, have the most at stake. Indonesia a little bit, the Natuna, for example, but by and large, what's the Indonesia foreign policy outlook on China's role and China's Belt and Road Initiative? And China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, for one, and then the other one, I'm just thinking about Burma, Myanmar. After the coup and the ongoing violence perpetrated by the military Tatmadaw, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore were at the forefront early on, calling for cessation of violence, dialogue, humanitarian assistance, but beyond that, calling for the release of political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi and Win Myint, the president, and also, beyond the release of prisoners, the restoration of democratic governance based on the election results from last November. These two clauses, these two demands were not included in the ASEAN, consensus, the 5-point consensus. But Indonesia still sticks with it. They still request, demand some kind of. They still mention democracy, along with Malaysia. I think Singapore has not mentioned it of late. So this is something that I think where ASEAN is stuck. That's why the 5-point consensus was very minimal, and I think it's the lowest hanging fruits from a very tall tree. But perhaps you can talk a little bit about China, Indonesia, and Indonesia's role in Myanmar's crisis.
Yeah, both really, really good questions. I think when it comes to China, again, it's really Jokowi's kind of economic focus that comes first. And I think he sees and his government sees that Indonesia really needs to deepen the economic relationship with China. It wants to attract more investment, more trade, but importantly, it wants to push up the value chain. So it wants to attract Chinese investment into the downstream processing of natural resources, into big infrastructure projects. So China is currently building its first ever export of high-speed rail to connect Jakarta to the city of Bandung, for example. And also, I think Jokowi's government has looked to China as a key source of vaccines, as well as others. So Indonesia has actually been deeply engaged with China in the last year. There have been 3 face-to-face visits between the Chinese and Indonesian foreign ministers. Jokowi's had quite a number of phone calls with Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese president. So I think the ambition has really been to try and hive off the territorial dispute. So there is a small part of Indonesia's Natuna Sea where the Chinese 9-dash line cuts through. And there have been a number of clashes in the past over access to fishing resources in those areas. And when Indonesia's pushed, Jokowi's kind of shown a strong response, at least kind of verbally and visually. But I think the Indonesian government really wants to hive off that small dispute into its own area so they can focus on deepening the economic relationship with China. And by and large, because they don't have an extensive maritime issue, there's no land border, of course, Indonesia has an easier relationship with China than Vietnam, than the Philippines, than Myanmar. So I think that's made life easy. On the other hand, there is this long history of kind of tensions towards the ethnic Chinese community in Indonesia, the minority community, which does have the potential to kind of flare up the bilateral national relationship. So there's kind of risk factors there, but by and large, Jokowi has doubled down on the relationship with China, while at the same time, you know, there is a concern that Indonesia might become over-reliant at some point, and Indonesia is using that relationship with China to try and lobby for more investment from the US, from Japan, from Australia, etc. On the question of what happens in Myanmar, as you say, Indonesia was out front in some respects with Singapore and Malaysia and the Philippines. I guess you were never going to see Vietnam and probably Thailand, Laos, Cambodia agreeing to political prisoners being released or calling for new elections or the old election results to be respected. So I think Indonesia got as much as it could. It still is free to push on its own for some of these elements. And we'll have to see. I think obviously Jokowi and Retno Marsudi have set quite a high bar of expectation that Indonesia will get involved. The challenge will be now, what do they do to follow up? Given these ASEAN's kind of principles of non-interference, what are the limits of how far Indonesia on its own is willing to go? Because we know ASEAN won't go much further than the current consensus. So, you know, they've set a test for themselves. We'll have to see how they do. I think it's certainly going to be very difficult for them to do much more. But the other thing I'd say is, I think the rest of the world can't just leave it to ASEAN and say, oh, well, ASEAN centrality, you deal with Myanmar. I think it's important for China, India, Japan, as well as the US, Australia, and others to see what they can do to work together. And probably the best hope, I mean, in the end, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, will resolve this with the people of Myanmar on the streets of their country. But the best the outside world can do is at least try and have a more common position. And I think ASEAN's done something. Indonesia's done something. Now it's to the rest of the world to try and see how we can help them.
Okay, thank you. Let's take, as a last engagement, a question from an audience member, a think tank, a young think tank intellectual who is Indonesian but working in Malaysia. So his question is, you know, he wishes that Jokowi would be clearer about conditions in Indonesia, and you know, when is a good time to return to Indonesia? Any advice from you? Would it be a good time now, or wait a bit?
I think it depends what your concerns are and what your family situation is and your professional and personal situation more generally. I mean, I think what we've seen with the pandemic is that it's unpredictable everywhere. Some of the world's richest, most developed countries, my home country, the UK, among them, have been amongst kind of the worst countries at managing the pandemic. We've had the worst outbreaks, some of the highest death tolls we've seen in the US. Then you see the US and the UK doing well with vaccinations for now, which is a hopeful sign. But I just worry that we still don't know enough about new variants and how long these vaccines last. So I don't think anywhere in the world can say it has things under control. We've seen a resurgence in Thailand and Cambodia as well recently as India. So nobody knows. But I do think Indonesia, by and large, has been much more stable than most people would have expected. The management of the pandemic hasn't necessarily been great, but Indonesian society has been quite resilient. People have tried to look after their families, their communities in their own ways. And I think that's true of a lot of the world, to be fair, that looking around the world, we haven't seen people looting during lockdowns or rioting. Most people have actually been pretty good and shown kind of the good sides of human nature, which I think is remarkable when you think about a lot of people's predictions for what would happen in a pandemic, or kind of the typical dystopian novel or movie where people are kind of looting stores, shooting each other, you know, cutting off access to towns and letting people starve to death. You know, we've had fights about toilet paper, right? That's about it. Of course, now we have more concerning fights over vaccines and vaccine nationalism. That's more of a kind of high-level political issue that is quite concerning to me. But by and large, I think Indonesian society and a lot of societies have stood this test quite well, which I think is a positive sign that, you know, human nature is pretty resilient even when facing really difficult challenges.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'll just tell everyone that Ben Bland's details for follow-ups are available on the Lowy Institute's website, and we'll come up on time, so I want to bring this to a close. Thank you very much, Ben, for your time there in Sydney, and here again is the book available in bookstores. Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. I recommend this book highly. Thank you very much, everyone who tuned in. And this will be recorded and available on the ISIS Thailand website, Facebook page, so you can view it subsequently. So thank you very much again. Goodbye from here in Bangkok. Thanks very much, Ben Bland. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks so much. Khop khun krap.
สวัสดีครับ